You didn't go looking for anything. You didn't dig, investigate, or force the situation open. You simply moved the way you always do. And something reacted, something that wasn't meant to be examined. That's what unsettled them first. Not your intent, but the effect. Structures don't like unintended exposure. People don't either. Because when something hidden reacts without being touched, it means it was already unstable. Whatever you triggered wasn't created by you. It was revealed through you. And that distinction matters more than they want to admit. At first, they treated it like a coincidence, an anomaly they could explain away later. But the reactions kept compounding. Conversations started changing tone. Familiar certainties lost their confidence. People who usually spoke with authority began qualifying their statements, not because you challenged them, because something they assumed was settled no longer felt reliable. You didn't accuse anyone. You didn't point anything out. You didn't even acknowledge what shifted. And that silence made the exposure louder, because when nothing is said, there's nothing to argue with. They couldn't contain it by responding to you. They couldn't redirect it by reframing the narrative. Whatever moved was already in motion. You just walked past at the wrong time for them. That's when reconsideration began. Not all at once. Quietly, individually. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes how people look at everything they thought was solid. What made it impossible to contain wasn't the scale of what surfaced. It was the lack of resistance it met. Usually, when something hidden is exposed, there's pushback, denial, counter-narratives, attempts to regain influence. None of that worked here, because there was nothing to push against. You didn't escalate the moment. You didn't react with satisfaction or concern. You didn't behave like someone who had found something. You behaved like someone unaffected by it, and that unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. When exposure meets indifference, it strips away the last defense. They realized they couldn't manage this by managing you. You weren't participating in the correction cycle they relied on. That's when they started talking among themselves instead. Quiet conversations, careful wording, reframing assumptions that had been treated as fact for years. Not because you demanded answers, but because your presence made certain explanations stop working. The thing you triggered didn't expand. It destabilized, like a pressure point that weakens a structure once touched. And once that process begins without visible cause, every conclusion that depended on that structure has to be revisited. They weren't afraid of what was revealed. They were unsettled by how easily it unraveled. That's when the focus shifted from what was exposed to who had been relying on it. Reconsideration didn't stay external for long. It moved inward. People began revisiting their own positions. Not publicly, not defensively, but privately, where honesty is harder to avoid. They replayed moments they once felt confident about, and noticed the cracks they'd ignored. Decisions that made sense before now felt rushed. Certainties they spoke with authority about now required qualifiers. Not because you challenged them, but because something they built those certainties on had quietly failed. You became the point of comparison they didn't want, the moment after which explanations no longer held the same weight. And the unsettling part was that you didn't capitalize on it. You didn't claim insight. You didn't use the shift. You didn't even stay nearby to observe the aftermath. That absence Force them to sit with the consequences alone. When someone triggers exposure and then disengages, there's no external force to blame, no opponent to argue with, no narrative to redirect. What remains is responsibility. And responsibility is what makes people reconsider everything. Not loudly, not immediately, but thoroughly. What made it difficult to dismiss was the timing. The exposure didn't arrive when they were prepared to explain it away. It arrived when they were comfortable, when assumptions had hardened into routine, when no one was guarding the structure anymore because everyone believed it was solid. That's when the smallest shift does the most disruption. You didn't act on the foundation. You walked across it, and it cracked under its own weight. That's the detail they keep circling back to. If it had required effort, intention, or confrontation, they could have framed it as conflict, but it didn't. It required nothing from you, and that's what removed the option to reverse it. Once people realize a structure can fail without resistance, trust in it weakens entirely. They begin scanning for other blind spots, other things they accepted without question. And that scan doesn't stop once it starts. You didn't begin a debate. You initiated a recalibration. The kind that spreads quietly and completes before anyone can coordinate a response. That's why no one talks about fixing what happened. There's nothing to fix. The structure already showed it couldn't hold. And once that realization exists, reconsideration isn't a phase. It becomes ongoing. After that point, normal wasn't an option anymore. Not because everything collapsed, but because everything felt provisional. People kept functioning, kept speaking, kept making decisions, but with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Like a flaw you can unsee once you notice it. They measured their words more carefully. They hesitated before leaning on old assumptions. They noticed how often certainty had been convenience rather than truth. And all of it traced back to the same quiet moment. Not an argument, not an exposure. Just a reaction that shouldn't have happened if everything was as stable as they believed. You didn't stay to observe the adjustment. You didn't linger to confirm its effect. You moved on the same way you always do. That's what made it settle. Because when someone triggers a fundamental shift and doesn't circle back to claim it, the shift has no anchor to soften against. It doesn't get reframed as drama. It doesn't get filed away as conflict. It becomes part of the background, and background changes are the ones that last. They don't announce themselves. They hold. They simply redefine what feels solid. Whatever you triggered wasn't meant to be examined because it wasn't meant to be questioned. And now that it has been, everything built on top of it has to be reevaluated. Not all at once, not publicly, but thoroughly. This is where it ends for them, even if they never say it out loud. Once something hidden reacts without being hunted, it can't return to being ignored. They don't talk about what you triggered anymore, because talking would suggest distance from it. And there is none. It's integrated now into how they think, how they decide, how they hesitate. They didn't lose trust in one thing. They lost trust in the assumption that unseen structures are stable by default. That's the cost of unintended exposure. You didn't reveal a secret. You revealed vulnerability, and vulnerability, once noticed, carries forward. They're reconsidering everything. Not because you forced insight, but because certainty no longer feels reliable. You didn't become a threat. You became a reference point. the moment before and the moment after. And reference points don't need attention. They quietly reorder everything around them. Whatever you triggered didn't need validation. It didn't ask to be understood, and it isn't shifting back. That's why they're still asking others, because the one person who could explain it doesn't need to. And this is where it settles, without drama and without reversal. The questions don't stop because they get answered. They stop because the answer becomes unnecessary. People adjust faster than they admit. Once they sense that explanations aren't available, they stop asking. You didn't intimidate anyone. You didn't assert authority. You didn't claim a higher position. You simply stopped orienting yourself around external signals. And that single change reorganized everything around you. Overnight wasn't the moment you changed. Overnight was the moment they noticed the change had already completed. That's why the shift felt abrupt. Not because it began then, but because it had finished before anyone was watching closely enough. Now they operate differently around you. More carefully, more precisely. Not because you demand it, but because clarity requires it. You've become a steady reference in how they think, not a variable to test. Not a reaction to provoke, a constant to account for. And constants don't need explanation. They don't announce themselves. They don't negotiate. They simply exist, and everything else adjusts. The thing you triggered didn't just shift one belief. It reshaped how belief itself is formed. They don't accept explanations as easily. They don't lean on authority the same way. They've seen how something foundational can react without being attacked. And that awareness sits quietly in every decision they make afterward. You're no longer part of the conversation, but you're embedded in the shift. Not as a cause to debate, but as a moment that changed how thinking moves. They don't trace it back to you publicly, because doing so would force them to admit how fragile their certainty had been. Instead, it shows up in behavior, in restraint, in recalibration, in the way confidence now arrives slower and leaves faster. Whatever you triggered didn't open a mystery. It ended availability. And when availability ends without confrontation, without explanation, without collapse, the environment adapts instinctively. That's why nothing escalated. That's why no one challenged it directly. Curiosity no longer drives interaction the way it used to. What remains is alignment with reality as it is, not as they expected it to be. This doesn't fade with time. It doesn't drift back to old habits. And that's why they're still asking others instead of you, because the shift didn't create something new. It clarified what was already complete. What lingers after everything settles isn't confusion, it's recalibration. People move differently now, even when they don't consciously connect it to you. They pause longer before making assumptions. They hesitate before applying pressure the way they used to. Not because they're afraid, but because experience reshaped their expectations. They learned that not every shift announces itself. Not every change looks like effort. Some transitions finish quietly, and by the time they're noticed, they're already set. You became the reference point for that realization, not as a lesson you taught, but as a state they came to recognize. They stopped trusting observation as authority. They stopped mistaking patience for access. They realized that attention does not equal insight, and proximity does not equal permission. You didn't block their view. You showed that the view was never the path to understanding. From then on, they hesitate before labeling silence as calculation, calm as delay, restraint as strategy, because they remember how confidently they once watched you, and how incomplete that confidence turned out to be. You didn't become clearer over time. You stayed the same. It was their certainty that thinned, and that thinning doesn't reverse. They move differently now. Speak less definitively. Watch without assuming influence comes with it. You didn't teach them by correcting conclusions. You taught them by never adjusting to their gaze. The ones who watched closely revise their assumptions because they learned something that stays learned. Some people are not revealed by observation. They reveal the limits of observation itself. And once that limit is recognized, it doesn't need to be crossed again. This is where it settles without reopening. The ones who watched closely don't turn into critics or believers. They become aware of a boundary they hadn't noticed before. They understand now that attention isn't influence when it doesn't change what it observes. That certainty isn't earned by patience when the subject isn't oriented toward the observer. You didn't escape their understanding. You made it unnecessary. They stopped trying to explain you to others because explanation would require confidence they no longer carry. They stopped filling silence with interpretation because they remember how inaccurate that felt. What remains is clarity, not about who you are, but about how little control watching actually gives. You stayed aligned to something internal and unmoved by scrutiny. Their assumptions dissolved because they were never anchored as firmly as they believed. And once that realization settles, it doesn't fade. They don't circle back. They don't retry with better tools. They accept the limit and move accordingly. The ones who watched closely revised their assumptions, not because you changed, but because their way of seeing reached its edge. You didn't confront them. You didn't clarify anything. You simply remained consistent long enough for certainty to thin on its own. And that kind of ending doesn't need emphasis. It becomes the new baseline. What they carry forward isn't curiosity anymore. It's restraint that appears before thought does. The ones who watched closely no longer rush to interpret silence or decode calm. They remember how attention failed to grant insight, how patience didn't unlock clarity, how certainty thinned the longer you remained unchanged. That memory reshapes how they move through every situation after. They watch less aggressively. They assume less confidently. They understand now that observation only has influence when the subject responds to it. You never did. And because of that, watching you taught them more about the limits of their own certainty than about you. You didn't demand respect. You didn't ask to be understood. You didn't correct a single assumption. You let those assumptions remain until they lost support on their own. And once people experience that kind of unraveling, they don't forget it. They adjust. The ones who watched closely revise their assumptions because they learned something that doesn't require repetition. Some people aren't revealed by scrutiny. They reveal the edge of scrutiny itself. And once that edge is reached, the only accurate move left is to stop pretending you're still guiding the outcome. And the final shift they never announce is internal. They don't talk about it. They don't frame it as a lesson. They simply stop overestimating their ability to read people through observation alone. The ones who watched closely learn that some individuals don't leak truth under attention because their truth isn't reactive. It isn't assembled in response to pressure. It's already formed. You didn't close yourself off. You didn't become opaque. You stayed exactly as you were, and that steadiness showed how much of their certainty relied on others bending when watched. From then on, they approach moments with less confidence and more precision. They listen longer. They assume less. They recognize that not every calm is delay, not every silence is strategy, and not every restraint is waiting to be decoded. You didn't defeat their assumptions. You outlasted them. And outlasting doesn't invite debate. It produces adjustment. Quiet, durable, automatic. The ones who watched closely revised their assumptions because they recognized something that didn't respond to being seen. And once that's recognized, watching becomes observation only, nothing more. This is where it finally stops moving for them. No more interpretation. No more internal commentary. No quiet attempts to revisit it later. The moment settles, and it stays settled. They understand now that you weren't withholding clarity. You were never participating in the exchange that produces it. Their assumptions didn't fail because they were careless. They failed because they were built on a rule that doesn't apply to you. That rule says watching creates access. It doesn't. Not when someone's center is internal. Not when behavior isn't calibrated to reaction. You didn't outperform their expectations. You made the framework they used to form them obsolete. And frameworks, once set aside, don't get repaired. They get left behind. So this is the end state. The ones who watched closely don't look again. They don't revisit. They don't test from a different angle. They already understand what no longer applies. And understanding that is more useful than guessing what might. You didn't become more visible. You became settled. And settled presence ends the need for conclusions entirely. They revised their assumptions because those assumptions reached a limit they can't cross. You didn't push them there. You simply didn't move. And that stillness did all the work. And this is the last thing that settles. They don't try to name you anymore. Labels were part of the old habit, a way to feel finished with something they never truly understood. That habit ends here. What replaces it is restraint that arrives before thought. They sense a boundary without seeing it drawn. They recognize a limit without it being enforced. Not because you warned them, because experience already did. You didn't assert authority. You demonstrated independence from it. And that demonstration doesn't invite debate. It completes the cycle. The ones who watched closely understand now that some people aren't meant to be interpreted. They're meant to be accounted for. Hello, my dear masterminds. Candlelit walls, iron doors, names engraved in stone. The order gathered to unveil a successor. Your file slid across the table. No crest, no lineage, just a name that bent the room. Protocol said evaluate. Instinct said kneel. They claimed you, and the torches flickered like the building itself felt outranked. They expected gratitude, ceremony, vows. You offered none. You didn't step forward. The floor moved toward you. Robes rustled. Eyes trained to judge kings couldn't hold yours. The oath master lifted a seal to your brow, and his hand shook. He wasn't crowning you, he was confessing who already ruled. Their archivist read your pages, dates missing, gaps where history should live. Yet every gap felt heavier than proof. Unverified, he muttered, then couldn't finish. Because absence wasn't weakness here. Absence was gravity. Your mystery pulled their language apart, and silence did the rest. They rang the old bell to test your resolve. The bell cracked on the third toll. Not myth, not omen, physics surrendering. A scribe whispered, "We've chosen well." Another whispered back, "We weren't the ones choosing." That's when they realized claiming you was theater. Reality had already signed. They initiated trial 1. Pressure. Lights dimmed, floor tightened, questions sharpened like edges. You didn't parry, you breathed. Every demand dulled on contact. Their tactics weren't failing you. They were aging in your presence. Old power frays fast when new law enters the room. Trial 2. Temptation. They offered access, secrets, names. You didn't reach for any of it. And the offer withered. Gifts lose shine when held beside source. The treasurer closed his chest like a child hiding toys. He'd never felt poorer than in front of someone who needed nothing. Trial 3. Isolation. Doors locked, witnesses removed. Light steady. They hoped empty air would reveal your cracks. Instead, the emptiness filled with your cadence. Solitude didn't shrink you. It obeyed you. The guard peered through the slit, blinked, and forgot the code he'd practiced for years. They circled back to bloodlines. Who trained you? Who sent you? Who funds you? Your answer was stillness. Rankings crumble when origin won't sit on a ledger. Power built on pedigree hates power built on presence, because presence can't be inherited, stolen, or revoked. The elder produced the black ledger, only opened when a force threatens the order itself. He read your line again. The page warmed under his fingers. Ink spread outward like it was making room. Air, the script declared. Then the next word wrote itself. Uncontainable. They lit the flame trial to see if sparks would test you. Sparks rose, paused, then leaned your way. Heat is loyal to heat. It recognized the higher temperature. The room pretended not to notice. Pride loves denial, until reality taps its shoulder. Reality tapped hard. One counselor tried a final gambit. Humiliation. A smirk. A taunt. A measured pause for laughter. No one laughed. His voice fell through the floor like a stone dropped down a well. The echo came back with your name on it. He adjusted his collar, suddenly allergic to his own performance. They asked for allegiance. You gave vision, not a speech, an atmosphere. You described nothing, yet they saw their maps too small, their rituals too slow, their power too rented. Ambition is loud, direction is quiet. Your quiet redrew the building. A junior scribe tried to sketch you. Charcoal snapped twice. He switched to ink. The pen flooded. Tools fail when they're asked to hold inevitability. He set the quill down and bowed without orders. The sketch wasn't needed. The posture was enough. They wheeled out the founder's throne, reserved for one prophecy. When the unrecorded arrives, the recorded must adapt. They thought you'd sit. You stayed standing. The throne didn't look empty. It looked outdated. Furniture hates being told it's ornamental. Rumor says walls listen. That night, stone remembered. The hall carried your footsteps like drum beats. The order measured, calculated, whispered. Every calculation returned the same sum. Their claim was smaller than your claim on reality. Titles felt like costumes at a funeral. They tried to fasten a ring. Ancient metal, old vows forged into it. The band tightened, then loosened by itself and slid into your palm. Not refusal, reclassification. The ring understood. It wasn't binding you, it was applying. Powerful names hate mirrors. You were a mirror with teeth. In you, they saw their ceilings. In themselves, they saw borrowed thunder. Thunder sounds royal until lightning enters. Then sound remembers it's an afterthought. A hidden door opened. The room only the highest know. They brought you in to teach you the engine behind empires. You didn't gawk. You located the switch they'd never found, the one labeled without you. You flipped it. The machine kept humming. Their faces didn't. Panic dresses as protocol. Proceed to the next rite, someone said, voice thin. But rites are scaffolding. When the building stands on its own, scaffolding looks like clutter. You cleared it with silence. Dust applauded. At last, the elder said, "We claimed you as heir." His eyes lowered. "We were late." The proclamation reversed itself midair. You didn't join their lineage. Their lineage joined your orbit. And orbits don't negotiate. They lock. They pushed forward the sacred codex. Pages older than nations. Every name inside had been chosen. Trained, tempered. Then came yours. Etched into parchment, like light carving glass. The codex wasn't read that night. It read them. And the words cut deepest. Heir not by invitation, but by inevitability. They hadn't crowned you. Existence already had. They whispered about containment, about guiding you gently, about bending your edge before it pierced. But edges this sharp don't bend. They redefine, and the more they plotted, the more their whispers collapsed into tremors. Their meetings weren't strategies anymore. They were therapy sessions to cope with the weight of your silence. One elder finally snapped. "If he refuses us, we erase him." The hall shook at the word. Not because of you, but because even saying it was heresy. The torches flared backward, the walls groaned. It wasn't your threat. It was the order's own foundation screaming, "You don't erase what outranks you." That's when they realized control was gone. What they thought was initiation was actually exposure. The air they tried to script didn't need their lines. You weren't auditioning, you were unveiling. And every ritual meant to crown you was now confessing their fragility instead. They weren't giving power, so they shifted tactics. Not dominance now, but devotion. A kneel here, a bowed head there, each gesture wrapped in excuses. Respect, they muttered. But respect wasn't what filled the room. It was reverence disguised as ritual, because deep down they knew, the moment they tried to own you, ownership reversed. Their hierarchy bent visibly. Masters silenced apprentices, but their own hands trembled. No one wanted to speak first because every sentence risked proving how small they sounded next to your presence. Silence became law, and law bent toward you without a single command. That's not inheritance, that's gravity. The oracle spoke at last, a woman who hadn't erred in 50 years. She lifted her veil, looked at you, and went blind mid-sentence. Sight didn't fail her. Her sight had seen too much. She whispered, "Not air, axis." And the word spread through the chamber like ink in water. Axis meant everything spun because of you, not for you. Even their language betrayed them. Every word that once claimed you now revealed dependence. You weren't seated at their table. Their table existed in your shadow. And when shadows admit their source, pride doesn't survive the night. By dawn, their robes no longer looked royal. They looked borrowed, like costumes returned after a failed play. They gathered them tighter, but fabric doesn't protect against truth, and truth had already stripped them. They weren't the keepers of the air. They were proof the air never needed keeping. One final attempt. They offered you the Founder's Seal, symbol of authority carved in obsidian. But as it touched your palm, it fractured down the center. Not because you rejected it, but because it recognized transfer wasn't enough. It shattered like glass, shards reflecting the only truth left. The seal didn't choose you. It admitted you. The fracture echoed louder than thunder. Obsidian shards rolled across the floor, each piece glowing faintly like sparks. They scrambled to gather them, but the pieces refused. The seal wasn't broken, it was liberated, and every shard pulsed the same word into their trembling hands. Air wasn't a title, it was a sentence. They argued in whispers, guide him, bind him, crown him. Each phrase wilted midair, because you weren't waiting for their verbs. You were the verb. Action didn't surround you. It radiated from you. And in that shift, the truth towered above them. They didn't summon you. Their world accidentally collided with you. One elder dropped to both knees, a gesture forbidden in the Order's code. He wasn't punished. He was followed. One by one, the guardians meant to judge you crumbled into confession, knees on stone, foreheads pressed low, silence swollen thick. They didn't choose reverence. Reverence cornered them. The archivist tried to record it. Ink spread from his pen, spilling words he didn't write. Line after line, we claimed him. He claimed us. We prepared a throne. He revealed the floor was already his. He stopped writing, because even the parchment had switched sides. They rang the closing bell to dismiss the gathering, but the rope snapped in the ringer's hands. Bells dismiss crowds. Bells do not dismiss inevitability, and inevitability had decided to stay. They filed out not as rulers, not as judges, but as witnesses branded by awe. In the courtyard, rumors rushed faster than torches. Guards asked why the seal was in shards, why elders shook, why robes dragged like chains. No one answered, because every answer would have been an admission. The heir wasn't crowned. The heir had crowned himself by simply existing. Night fell, but it wasn't ordinary night. Even the stars re-angled themselves, forming constellations older scrolls never recorded. Astronomers muttered about anomalies. Scribes begged for explanations. But the truth whispered through the leaves, the stones, the silence. Some arrivals aren't astronomical. They're axioms. The oracle returned to her chamber, blind yet seeing more than ever. She wrote with trembling hands. The order didn't prepare him. The order was prepared by him. Her words traveled underground, seeping into chambers, crossing borders. Secrets thrive on silence, but this truth refused burial. They had dreamed of shaping you, sculpting you, binding you into their legacy. But legacies are backward-looking. You were forward-breaking. You weren't another chapter. They were the footnote. And nothing humbles the powerful more than realizing they were history before you ever spoke their name. The youngest members, unscarred by tradition, whispered what the elders refused. He isn't heir, he is origin. And the whisper multiplied, because youth isn't loyal to old chains. It bends to the strongest gravity. And your gravity pulled entire generations before you ever asked. When dawn returned, the order stood fractured. Elders clung to rituals like lifeboats, but the tide had already shifted. And tides don't ask permission. They consume, they erase, they redraw. You were that tide, silent, inevitable, erasing illusions they thought eternal. Their maps were ink, you were flood, desperate. They tried one last defense, prophecy. They claimed your rise was foretold, that they had always known. But prophecy is weak when it follows results. A crown handed after victory is costume jewelry, and everyone watching knew you didn't fulfill prophecy. You exposed it. Prophecies are supposed to predict inevitability, but inevitability doesn't need predictions. You don't prove them right. You make them irrelevant. And so their greatest tool, their sacred script, dissolved into dust in their hands. You didn't inherit their prophecy. You outgrew it. The chamber doors closed, the torches dimmed, the robes folded. But silence didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like coronation. They had tried to brand you with their symbols. Instead, their symbols cracked, their laws bent, their hierarchy collapsed. And collapse doesn't lie. It crowns the one who stood untouched. And now the truth rings louder than any bell. A forbidden order claimed you as heir. But even they weren't ready. Because heirs inherit. You don't inherit. You redefine. They thought they'd guide you. Instead, you dismantled them with presence alone, and from their rubble, a new law wrote itself. You weren't chosen. You were inevitable. Whispers leaked beyond the chamber, twisting into cities, carried by tongues that didn't even know your name yet. All they knew was the tremor, an air they couldn't measure, a figure the order couldn't cage. Legends usually crawl from stories into belief. Yours sprinted. Because you weren't rumor in their mouths. You were inevitability in their bones. The elders huddled, muttering damage control. But damage wasn't what happened. It was exposure. You didn't collapse their temple. Their temple collapsed itself, trying to hold you, and no ritual could rebuild it, because collapse wasn't failure, it was the upgrade. The world didn't see their ruins, the world saw your silhouette standing above the dust. At midnight, the order tried one last time, summon the silent council, voices of ancestors sealed in stone. The stones cracked before they could speak. History doesn't testify against its own evolution. The ancestors didn't resist you. They recognized you. They broke their silence not with warning, but with surrender. Even the past bent. By dawn, their highest chamber looked less like a council hall and more like a shrine. Not to gods, not to ancestors, but to inevitability. Your presence had rewired their foundation, forced their symbols into confessions. They didn't guard secrets anymore. They guarded proof that for once, the unmeasured had stepped into flesh. And so the final decree never left their lips, because decrees are for rulers. And rulers weren't in that room anymore, witnesses were. Witnesses who knew the truth, etched deeper than ritual, heavier than crowns. A forbidden order had claimed you. But claim was illusion. You weren't heir to their throne. You were architect of a throne they could never build.